After one of the greatest and most chaotic college football seasons we've had in recent memory, we've finally reached the inaugural 12-team college football playoff, and I couldn't be more excited for it. Amongst all the madness this year, we've been theorizing, predicting, and arguing over who should and shouldn't get their chance to compete for a national championship. With 12 teams in the field now, it gives more teams a chance that would have been left out in years prior in the 4-team era, so there isn't much argument to leave out some of the teams that otherwise would probably make it. But this also makes for more underdog stories. This year we've seen Indiana, SMU, and Arizona State make some pretty unlikely runs to the CFP after their conference preseason polls didn't have them finishing anywhere close to contention. But even in the 4-team playoff era, we've seen a handful of teams that had relatively unique circumstances to get into the CFP after very few would have predicted that outcome. My name is Caleb, and though it's been pretty rare in the CFP era, we have seen a few unlikely runs to the college football playoff in its 10-year existence, where a perfect set of circumstances had to occur for these runs to happen. A lot of the time, some of these teams have been used as an excuse to keep similar teams out of the playoff because of how their seasons ended, but in my opinion, it shouldn't take away from what it took for these teams to get there to at least get a chance. Today, I want to revisit a few of these teams' seasons, how they ended up performing in the playoff, and some of those notable games from those seasons. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. Let me preface this by saying that before this season, almost every single team that made the college football playoff was either predicted to do so or had a really good chance to make it going into the season. The 2020 Notre Dame Fighting Irish was a team highly ranked going into that season, but the circumstances on how they ended up making the playoff may be the most unique since the format started, because I truly believe this was one of the more interesting paths to the CFP, all things considered. So this selection wasn't unlikely due to the play on the field or Notre Dame's history, but the circumstances surrounding it. Something that might get lost to time is that in 2020, for the first time ever, Notre Dame football actually competed in and played a conference schedule due to COVID shaking up the college football landscape. It was pretty surreal to see the Fighting Irish of the ACC in football, conference jersey patches and field logos included. Notre Dame has some of the most rivalries in the country, and the virus ended up gutting travel plans, so their games against USC, Navy, and Stanford were all removed from the schedule and replaced with games within the ACC. But like every other team in the country, COVID put up wilt numbers, as according to head coach Brian Kelly, they couldn't even have pregame meals anymore after an asymptomatic player spread the virus throughout the team like wildfire early in the season. But despite all the issues with the virus and a couple of postponed games, they were one of the few teams in the country that got to play a pretty full schedule, which no doubt ended up helping their college football playoff case at the end of the year. After starting the season ranked 10th in the country, they were undoubtedly the second best team in the ACC behind the Trevor Lawrence-led Clemson Tigers, who had just come off a national championship loss to LSU the season before. It was going to be a collision course to the ACC championship game, which included a midseason preview on November 7th in South Bend. But before they could get there, the Irish dominated the first half of their schedule, where every game except for their narrow win against Louisville at home was a blowout. Everyone can admit that the ACC was not the strongest Power 5 conference in the country in 2020, but the Irish took care of business every week to that point, and by the time of their midseason clash with the Tigers, they were the 4th ranked team in the country. Number 1 Clemson would visit South Bend, but they do it without their top NFL quarterback prospect, as he had tested positive for COVID before the game. Instead, it was going to be true freshman DJ Uiagalelei under center. Notre Dame would take a 24-13 lead in the first half behind the dominant first 2 quarters from sophomore running back Kyron Williams and a defensive fumble recovery return for a touchdown by that season's ACC Defensive Player of the Year, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. And it may be crazy to say in hindsight, but DJU led a pretty furious comeback in the second half to give the Tigers a 1-score lead late in the 4th, but Notre Dame quarterback Ian Book would lead a game-tying drive to get the Irish to overtime, where they would get the 47-40 win. This was by far the best win of the season for Notre Dame, as even without Trevor Lawrence playing for the Tigers, taking down the number 1 team in the country helped catapult the Irish to number 2 in the polls headed into the next week. After a couple more dominant ACC wins against UNC and Syracuse, they would find themselves in the ACC championship game with the best record in the conference. In a rematch against Clemson, this time with Trevor Lawrence back, the Tigers would steamroll the Irish 34-10. But all things considered, Notre Dame had a great season with this being their only loss, but their CFP case was arguably the most unique to that point. They were 10-1, their first time playing a full conference schedule, the fact that they actually played 11 games that season, and had a pretty solid margin of victory at around 20.5 points per game. They had a lot of arguments based on things that were kind of out of their control, which other teams didn't necessarily have that year. COVID affected each team and schedule differently, and if your games were canceled or your best players couldn't play because of the virus, then that was just tough luck that season. The CFP committee would make up their minds, and the Fighting Irish would make the playoff as the fourth and final team to get in. At that time, it was pretty much between them and Texas A&M who were being considered for that final playoff spot, as A&M had an extremely strong case in their own right. But Notre Dame had a date with Alabama in the Rose Bowl, and they were completely outmatched, let's be honest. Bama's offense was absolutely dominant and just too much for the Irish to handle, as they'd lose 31-14 in a game that was never really close. But a 10-2 season and a second ever CFP appearance in one of the most unpredictable years ever is respectable. Whether you want to call their CFP run in 2020 unlikely, controversial, or even perfectly reasonable, it is one of the most interesting in my opinion, and a selection that is still argued about to this day. And speaking of arguing, since the CFP's inception in 2014, we have argued up and down about the inclusion of Group of 5 teams and whether they have the ability to build a legit case to make the playoffs and compete if they were able to get there. I've always been a G5 defender when it comes to their inclusion in the college football playoff, but I know it's always going to be a conversation when it comes to the committee and the wider college football fan base. With the 12-team bracket, there's more ways for G5 inclusion, but in the 4-team era, it seemed like it would never happen until the 2021 Cincinnati Bearcats of the American Athletic Conference would break that barrier. After the undefeated 2017 UCF team was semi-controversially left out of the playoff, it was questioned what a Group of 5 team would actually have to do to get a chance to compete for a national title. 4 years later, Cincy would try their absolute best to answer these questions. Coming into the 2021 season, they were the highest ranked mid-major program in the country, starting the season ranked 8th along with some of their players on a handful of award watch lists. Most notably quarterback Desmond Ridder and cornerback Sauce Gardner. Head coach Luke Fickell had something special brewing with this Bearcats team. They had one of the better G5 schedules in the country to where they could build a very solid case for themselves to make the playoff. This included one of the better teams in the MAC in Miami, Ohio, a Big Ten opponent in Indiana that they'd have the opportunity to dominate on the road, and a top 10 matchup at Notre Dame in South Bend, as they themselves had just come off a CFP appearance. Not to mention their American Conference schedule, which was fairly solid in its own right. After starting a pretty dominant 3-0, the Bearcats would travel to South Bend for the rare G5 independent top 10 matchup, where they could prove to the rest of the country that this team was for real. Luke Fickell would straight up just outcoach Brian Kelly, and Cincinnati, behind dominant performances from Desmond Ridder and Alec Pierce, would walk into Notre Dame Stadium to get a 24-13 win. This was their signature win of the season and one of the biggest wins in program history, as it would set the tone for the rest of the season, a year where Cincy was clearly the best mid-major team in the country and one of the best G5 programs in college football history. As the best team in the American, their in-conference opponents put up little fight as they'd win almost every single game for the rest of the season by double digits. During the regular season, they'd peak as the second-ranked team in the country, and by the time of the American Championship game, they were 12-0 and the 4th-ranked team in the country. And one more chance to impress the CFP committee and punch their ticket to the playoff, they'd face their final test of the season against an 11-1 Houston Cougars team who was by far and away the second best team in the American. They could spoil Cincinnati's season in this game and make the CFP committee's decision on letting a G5 team in the playoff a whole lot easier. But Cincy wasn't going for it, and they would get a 35-20 win behind championship game MVP Jerome Ford's 187 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. Conference championship week had come to an end, and the Bearcats had built the best case for a Group of 5 team to make the playoff for the first time ever. This included a 13-0 record, a dominant Power 5 win, 2 ranked wins which included a top 10 victory on the road and a conference championship victory, and one of the best win margins in the entire country. And from a talent standpoint, this team was going to be well represented in the next few NFL drafts. There wasn't much argument to keep the Group of Five out of the playoff this time, and the 2021 Cincinnati Bearcats would be the first of their kind to make the college football playoff. When the playoff was first established in 2014, I don't think anyone truly thought a G5 team would make a 4-team field, all things considered. But in 2021, a perfect storm kind of formed for the Bearcats. The Power 5 conference champions were in a dilemma, as the Big 12, ACC, and Pac-12 all had multi-loss champions, which was the first time in the CFP era where that had occurred. Oklahoma State probably would have had the best case to get in over Cincinnati had they have won the Big 12, but Baylor's shocking upset over them essentially kept the committee from putting the Cowboys in. The Bearcats received the 4th and final seed, but as you know, they would get steamrolled by Alabama in the semifinal. Had the playoff not expanded in 2024, a lot of people will point to this game as a reason to keep Group of 5 teams out of the playoff, but that's what the regular season is for, and I believe if you have a great resume, you should at least be considered, which is why, in my opinion, the 2021 Bearcats had the most unlikely run to the playoff during the 4-team era. And come the 2022 season, we get another unlikely run to the CFP, this time from a preseason unranked Power 5 team. Since 2014, every single college football playoff selection entered the season ranked at least somewhere in the top 25. The climb from unranked to playoff spot was almost seen as impossible at that point, especially in a 4-team field, but Sonny Dykes' 2022 TCU Horned Frogs in his first year as head coach would be the first team to accomplish this feat. Preseason Big 12 media polls had TCU finishing around 7th in a pretty deep conference, where only 2 teams would end the season without being bowl eligible. And coming off a 5-win season the previous year, returning a lot of their roster, and bringing in some under-the-radar transfers, it was expected that they could maybe reach a bowl game and build from there, but their schedule was going to be a gauntlet. After the first few weeks of the season, once they really got into Big 12 play, it was going to be ranked opponent after ranked opponent after ranked opponent. In Week 4, the 3-0 unranked Horned Frogs would host 18th ranked Oklahoma at home in Fort Worth. TCU came out hot with a 27-10 lead after the first quarter, on their way to a 55-24 blowout to ensure that they'll be ranked the next week. They jump all the way to 17th in the country before their matchup with 19th ranked Kansas, and the Frogs would get their 2nd ranked win in a row, and it seemed like something might be there. For the 3rd week in a row, they'd play another ranked opponent at home, as the 8th ranked Oklahoma State Cowboys would make the trip from Stillwater. When at first it looked like the Frogs had come back down to earth a bit, they'd storm back from a 14-point second half deficit to force overtime where they'd squeak out a win. There hadn't been a team surging from unranked to top 10 like this TCU team had in a while, and along with their strength of schedule and quality wins, they were not slowing down. Following their win against the Cowboys, they'd be ranked 8th in the country and extend their winning streak to 10 by November 12th, including 2 more ranked wins over Kansas State and Texas, putting their total number of ranked wins at 5. The most nerve-wracking game of that regular season ended in one of the most insane sequences you'll ever see in a college football game. The Horned Frogs would meet a very scrappy Baylor team in Waco, where the Bears had TCU on the ropes and would have essentially ended any hope of their college football playoff aspirations. Not only would Baylor play heavy spoiler, but this was the rivalry game, one of the oldest rivals in college football. Baylor had a 2-point lead with TCU driving in the final seconds of the game with no timeouts. Max Duggan led a drive down the field into a field goal range where they would spike the ball with 22 seconds left on 3rd down. With no timeouts, they decided to run the ball with Amari DiMercato, and on 4th down and no way to stop the clock, the field goal unit absolutely books it out onto the field with just 4 seconds left. TCU kicker Griffin Kell boots a 30-yarder as time expires to keep the Horned Frogs undefeated. I remember watching the ending of this game live, and it was truly insane to watch them execute that in real time. The formerly unranked Horned Frogs were now the 3rd ranked team in the country, and after a blowout win against Iowa State, they found themselves in the Big 12 championship game in a rematch against Kansas State. The Big 12 championship game was close all game, but the Wildcats would do their best at throwing a wrench in the Frogs' plans, because after a 12-0 regular season, TCU would suffer their first loss all year in overtime to Kansas State. And while this would affect seeding, there was no way after the season that TCU had that the committee would penalize them after a close, ranked loss in their conference championship game, though we have seen stranger things. The final CFP rankings were released in early December, and TCU would make it as the 3rd seed. Despite being a Power 5 team, I wouldn't disagree that they also have a case for the most unlikely run to the college football playoff. In 2022, they were maybe the least talented on paper out of the rest of the field, but they would shock the world in their semifinal game versus Michigan. TCU jumped out to a 21-6 lead in the first half before Michigan's high-powered offense kept closing the gap in the second. Late in the fourth quarter, the Wolverines got within one score several times, but could just not get over the hump. The second half of that game was absolute cinema though, and TCU would do the impossible and make the national championship game against number 1 Georgia. But unfortunately for TCU, that game ended up being one of the worst national championship games in recent memory, and people are always going to hold that game specifically against them and similar teams like them. But they did still win a playoff game against a higher seed, and I think that should still work in their and similar teams' favor for future selection debates. The 12-team era that we're entering into this season is going to give us more interesting and unique paths for teams to get into the college football playoff. And while the system is never going to be perfect or every deserving team will get in, it will always make for really great storylines and future implications that keep us coming back every single season. Teams like 2020 Notre Dame, 2021 Cincinnati, and 2022 TCU are all examples of teams that may not have been title favorites to start the season, but through wild and unique sets of circumstances, made relatively unlikely runs to compete for a national championship. Let me know how you felt about the 4-team college football playoff era in the comments, and if you think the 12-team era will improve on some of the flaws of the system beforehand. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.